Can we talk about each of the sort of available tools in the
Yeah,
toolbox
absolutely.
for recovery?
Absolutely.
I think that'd be an interesting piece. Everything here is anecdotal. I'm not a
Hmm.
doctor, but I've been an armchair scientist and researcher here for several years. As far as I understand it right now, we can look at that question two ways. The first is the Western mindset. What do we see it as? And then what does it look like in the indigenous cultures where it's coming from? And I think both should be taken into account. So when we look at something like psilocybin, that's been grown all over North and South America and now in much of the world for quite a long time. It has a storied and powerful tradition as a sacred plant teacher. It's typically understood in the mystical sense as being sort of mischievous children in nature. It's got a plurality to it, to its experience that other medicines don't seem to have. And in reality, what it does is it opens up the connections between the ports firing in your brain for either not just basic thought but memory retrieval, memory. It opens up your neural pathways in ways that are frankly amazing.
Hmm.
If you looked at on a graph a typical connectivity for a brain and you were to say there are, for example, four lines going across that graph that represent your neural activity, when you introduce psilocybin, instead of four lines there'd be something like 40 or 400. So it's an incredibly powerful tool. It can lead to ego death and ego dissolution, which is an incredibly different topic of it in its own. We could talk about that for hours, but that can be pretty scary sometimes. So again, any of these things that I'm talking about, I'm always going to say this should be done in a mindful, in a legal way, and certainly with practitioners that understand the capabilities and what's necessary to protect you. So psilocybin is fairly safe. It's not something that you can really die from, but it is something that you may disassociate a little bit from yourself enough that you could have bad encounters with people that aren't in that same
Hmm.
state. Some people get killed by police, for example, when they're having a bad episode. Ibogaine comes from the Bwiti tribe in Africa, and it's, as I understand it, a chewed bark. I've not done Ibogaine, but a lot of veterans are seeing success with the cessation of any sort of addictive patterns, whether complex addictions to things like heroin or in any of the opioids that are rapidly and easily available to our community. Or I guess when we look at Ibogaine as a substance, I don't think that there's anything on the planet that offers the same level of immediate recovery from addictive personality
Wow.
traits. So people are anecdotally taking Ibogaine on one time over the weekend that have intense, for example, heroin addictions, and they're able to kick that weekend
Wow.
with no withdrawal symptoms. That's again all anecdotal. You develop enough case studies and suddenly it becomes the trend.
Sure.
Ayahuasca, on the other hand, is, I think, a very powerful plant teacher that instead of having a direct push towards addiction, instead I think is very valuable when we talk about shifting the default mode or recovering from unseen mental traumas. Trauma has a way of lasting in your brain, both physically and chemically, and it shifts how you process information in several key regions in your brain. And ayahuasca seems to either restart those areas or re-encourage the connection or interconnectivity between those areas, as well as have a complete anti-inflammatory effect on the nervous system. So a lot of the hallmarks of PTSD expression tend to come from, at least research would suggest, inflammation along the
I
entire
see.
system itself.
Okay.
So yeah, it's got some pretty amazing properties. And then finally, San Pedro or peyote or mescaline. This is something that's typically done during the day. It can last between 8 and 10 hours, and it's typically a bright and connected journey, whereas ayahuasca is leaning back into a river and surrendering to the experience while being interactive with it. Ibogaine is seeing your life on a reel and reacting to it. And as I said, mescaline is just interacting with life as it
Mm.
happens. And these tools can each be applied to specific, I think, mental illnesses that we see today. And when I look at the indigenous people that have been wardens of these medicines for millennia, I don't see them as having backwards culture or some sort of purposeless religious rites associated with these practices. I wonder if what they've actually done in their ceremonies is capture best practices for long-term positive
Mm.
outcomes. So I try to show that sense of reverence in our own programming.
That's wonderful. Do you see those four medicines as the palette, the diaspora of plant medicines in the future for the U.S., and how do you see that being sustainable?